A woman crouches at the edge of a fire, sometime around 4,000 years ago in the Nile Delta. She is grinding something. Not grain. The motion is the same. Slow, deliberate rotations of stone on stone. But what's beneath the pestle is a dry paste of acacia leaves and dates, and she is working it until the texture is fine enough to press into a cone shape with her palms. When she is done, she will place it inside her body before sex. This is not guesswork. This is a prescription. It was written down. The Kahun Gynaecological Papyrus, dated to approximately 1825 BCE and named for the Egyptian city where it was discovered in 1889, is the oldest surviving medical document dealing specifically with women's reproductive health. It contains explicit instructions for contraceptive preparations. Acacia tips, honey, dates, ground and mixed. The papyrus does not frame this as unusual or transgressive. It reads like a recipe, practical, unashamed, a problem and a solution. Most people, when they think about ancient humans and sex, do not think about what came after it. They think about cave paintings, animal skins, survival, procreation as destiny. The assumption running quietly underneath every documentary and every museum display is that ancient women simply had children, as many as the body could produce, because that was nature, because that was inevitability, because nothing else existed. That assumption is wrong. If this is already landing, subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The desire to control reproduction is not a modern instinct. It is not a product of the 20th century or the 19th or the Enlightenment. Across the documented ancient world, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, India, China, there is continuous, overlapping, sometimes contradictory evidence that people thought hard about this problem. They developed methods, they tested them, they passed them down. Some of what they used was pharmacologically inert, the ancient equivalent of wishful thinking. But some of it worked, and the most unsettling part of the story is that researchers spent decades assuming the ancient methods were mostly superstition, until they ran the chemistry and found out that several of them were not. The biological reality driving all of this is one that almost never gets discussed plainly. A woman in the ancient world who became pregnant every time she ovulated, starting in her early teens and continuing until her late 30s, would spend the majority of her adult life either pregnant or nursing. Pregnancy in the absence of modern obstetric care carried serious mortality risk. A 2021 analysis of skeletal remains from prehistoric European populations found maternal mortality indicators in a significant proportion of female burials in the 15 to 35 age range. Childbirth was not a safe background event. It was one of the most dangerous things a body could do. The women grinding acacia paste by the fire were not engaging in rebellion. They were doing risk management. So the question this video is actually answering is not whether ancient humans tried to control reproduction. They did, consistently, across every civilization we can document. The real question is, what did they actually use? How did they understand what they were doing? And what does the chemistry tell us now about how well it worked? The answer moves through 5 categories: physical barriers, plant-based contraceptives, what the ancient world understood about timing, herbal abortifacients, and the social architecture that surrounded all of it. Each one reveals something different about how ancient people understood the body, and how close, sometimes, they came to getting it exactly right. Start with the physical. The idea of blocking conception mechanically is ancient in ways that most people find genuinely surprising. The oldest documented contraceptive pessaries, objects or substances placed at the cervix, appear not just in the Kahun Papyrus, but in the Ebers Papyrus, another Egyptian medical text dating to around 1550 BCE. Both documents describe preparations that share one key ingredient: acacia. This is where the story gets chemically interesting. Acacia ferments in the presence of vaginal bacteria to produce lactic acid. Lactic acid is a spermicide. Modern contraceptive jellies contain it. The women following these prescriptions 3,500 years ago were unknowingly deploying a compound that modern reproductive pharmacology uses deliberately. The acacia cone was not magic. It was not placebo. It was a delivery mechanism for a spermicidal agent that the body of the person using it would help produce. The Egyptians also described mixtures involving crocodile dung, and researchers have noted that crocodile dung is alkaline, which would alter vaginal pH in ways that are theoretically hostile to sperm motility. Whether this worked consistently is debated. But the underlying logic, that changing the chemical environment of the vagina could prevent conception, was not wrong. The Egyptians did not know about sperm. They did not know about pH, but they were working within a conceptual framework of blocking or altering something, and at least one of their methods tracked the biology correctly. Greece gave us something different. Around the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Greek medical writers, including authors whose work fed into the Hippocratic corpus, described a plant called silphium in such detail and with such enthusiasm that it has fascinated historians of medicine ever since. Silphium was a species of giant fennel that grew in a narrow coastal strip of what is now Libya, centered on the city of Cyrene. Cyrene built its economy around this plant so completely that it put the image of silphium on its coins. The plant was harvested, its resinous sap extracted, and the resulting substance, called laser, was traded across the Mediterranean at prices that made it one of the most expensive commodities of the ancient world. Ancient sources describe laser as used for multiple medical purposes, but several Greek and Roman writers specifically mention it in the context of contraception and the termination of early pregnancy. By the 1st century BCE, silphium had been harvested to extinction. No living specimen has been confirmed since. The plant exists now only in ancient texts and coin images, and in the ongoing argument among botanists and historians about whether any related species carries the same properties. The argument matters because related plants in the genus Ferula do. Ferula species contain compounds called ferulic acid derivatives and certain terpenoids that have demonstrated activity in animal studies as anti-implantation agents. A 1986 study by Etienne Beaulieu, one of the researchers behind the development of mifepristone, the modern pharmaceutical abortifacient, examined several plants from the same family and confirmed biologically active compounds. The ancient enthusiasm for silphium was not purely cultural. The plant may have done something real. Queen Anne's lace, the common name for wild carrot, Daucus carota, appears in the Hippocratic writings and in Dioscorides' 1st century CE pharmacological text De Materia Medica as a postcoital contraceptive. Women were instructed to consume the seeds in the days following intercourse. Ethnobotanist John Riddle, whose 1992 book Eve's Herbs remains the most thorough academic survey of ancient plant contraception, documented that wild carrot seeds are still used as a morning-after intervention in rural India and parts of Appalachia. Laboratory research has since confirmed that high doses of carrot seed extract interfere with progesterone synthesis in animal models, and progesterone is essential to implantation. Whether the doses achievable from eating seeds were pharmacologically sufficient is still contested. Researchers argue about bioavailability and dosage, but the mechanism is real. Pomegranate appears in multiple ancient traditions. The Egyptians referenced it, the Greeks knew it. A 1933 study found that pomegranate rind contains compounds with estrogenic activity, meaning they interact with estrogen receptors in the body. The estrogen-progestogen balance is central to the menstrual cycle and to the conditions that allow or prevent implantation. A substance that disrupts that balance, consumed in sufficient quantities, could theoretically disrupt fertility. The research on pomegranate as a contraceptive is not conclusive, and no one is suggesting it was reliably effective at the doses ancient women consumed. But the biochemical activity is there. It is not nothing. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. Pennyroyal is harder to discuss without noting the danger. The plant, Mentha pelagium, appears in Greek, Roman, and later medieval European texts as both a contraceptive and an abortifacient. Dioscorides lists it. Tyrannus of Ephesus, the 2nd century CE Roman physician whose gynecology is the most comprehensive surviving ancient text on women's medicine, discusses it alongside other plant preparations. Pennyroyal contains pouligone, a volatile compound that in large doses is toxic to the liver and kidneys. It has caused deaths in modern women who attempted to use it as an abortifacient before the availability of safe legal options. The plant does appear to have biological activity in the relevant direction. Animal studies have confirmed effects on implantation, but the margin between a dose that has physiological effect and a dose that causes serious organ damage is narrow. Ancient healers using it were working without any of the pharmacological understanding that would have let them calibrate that margin. Some women using pennyroyal preparations were helped. Some were harmed. The ancient record does not tell us the ratio. Artemisia, the genus that includes wormwood and mugwort, appears in Chinese medical texts going back to the Han Dynasty, in Ayurvedic texts from the Indian subcontinent, and in Greek and Roman sources. The overlap across unconnected traditions is one of the signals that researchers like Riddle use when evaluating ancient plant medicines. If the same plant turns up in the same reproductive context in multiple cultures with no contact, that convergence suggests the plant was doing something observable. Artemisia species contain compounds, artemisinins and related molecules, that have demonstrated effects on the uterus in modern pharmacological research, including stimulating uterine contractions. Whether the preparations ancient healers made were concentrated enough to produce reliable effects is, again, a matter of ongoing debate. The convergence is real. The clinical certainty is not. Timing-based methods deserve more than the dismissal they usually receive. The ancient world's understanding of ovulation was wrong in its details, but not entirely directionless. Soranus, in his Gynecology, advised that the days immediately before and after menstruation were least likely to result in pregnancy, and that the middle of the cycle was the most fertile. This is almost the inverse of biological reality. Ovulation occurs in the middle of the cycle, not at the edges. But Soranus's advice was at least organized around the correct concept, that fertility varies across the cycle rather than being constant. Some ancient texts from India's Ayurvedic tradition come closer, identifying a fertile window that maps more accurately to the post-menstrual phase. The theory underlying the observation was wrong in every tradition, but the observation itself, that sex at some times is more likely to result in pregnancy than at others, was correct. The physical barrier methods that didn't rely on chemistry are documented primarily from later classical sources, but the practices they describe are almost certainly older. Soranus recommends having women jump backwards 7 times immediately after intercourse, movement as a spermicidal strategy. He also recommends pressing a soft wool pad soaked in oil against the cervix before sex. Oil as a spermicide is pharmacologically plausible. It degrades sperm cell membranes. Olive oil, cedar oil, and various resins appear across ancient contraceptive texts in roles that suggest their viscous, occlusive properties were being deliberately exploited. The wool pad soaked in oil is not entirely without logic. It is covering the cervix with a substance that is hostile to sperm viability. Whether it was reliable is another matter entirely. The methods were never the whole story. Behind every ground paste and every bitter seed infusion was a social world that made the knowledge possible. People who held it, people who taught it, and people who decided who was allowed to have it. In the ancient Greek and Roman world, that person was usually a midwife. The Latin term was obstetrix. These were not marginal figures. Soranus devotes the opening section of his Gynecology to describing what a competent midwife should know: anatomy, pharmacology, diet, the management of difficult births, and, explicitly, methods for preventing conception and terminating early pregnancy. The midwife was the repository. She knew which plant preparations had worked for which women, who had sourcing relationships with herbalists and traders, and who understood, through accumulated clinical observation across decades, which methods produced results and which did not. This knowledge moved through women, and it moved carefully. Soranus makes a clinical distinction between contraceptives and abortifacients. He defines a contraceptive as something that prevents conception, and an abortifacient as something that ends an established pregnancy. But he discusses both in the same practical register, without moral hierarchy between them. His concern is efficacy and safety. He recommends contraceptives over abortifacients on the grounds that contraception is less physically taxing on the body. This is a medical argument, not a moral one. In ancient China, texts like the Benkao Gongmu list dozens of plant preparations associated with regulating menstruation and preventing pregnancy. The language is often indirect. Regulating the menses in ancient Chinese medical texts is a phrase historians of medicine understand as covering a range of interventions, including the termination of unwanted pregnancies. The indirection was functional. It allowed knowledge to circulate in texts that could pass through bureaucratic scrutiny, while remaining useful to the women and healers who knew how to read it. India's Arthashastra, Kautilya's political treatise from approximately the 4th century BCE, includes contraceptive prescriptions in a section dealing with the welfare of women in the royal household. The Arthashastra is not a medical text. It is a document about statecraft. The fact that it contains these prescriptions tells you that managing reproduction was considered part of the administrative competence of a functioning state, not a private or transgressive matter. What the male side of ancient contraception looked like is a shorter story. The most consistently documented male method across ancient traditions is withdrawal, coitus interruptus, which appears in sources from the Hebrew Bible to Greek medical texts to Roman poetry in ways that suggest it was widely practiced. Its effectiveness, practiced consistently, is not negligible. Modern estimates put typical use effectiveness at around 78%, lower than hormonal contraception, meaningfully better than nothing. What the demographic evidence actually tells us about how well all of this worked collectively is one of the more striking findings in this area of research. Ancient populations did not reproduce at their theoretical biological maximum. A woman who begins menstruating at around 14 and lives to 45 has a theoretical maximum of somewhere between 15 and 20 pregnancies if she never attempts to limit fertility. Ancient skeletal populations do not reflect this number. Studies of ancient Roman, Egyptian, and Greek remains consistently find average completed family sizes, suggesting somewhere between 3 and 6 children reaching early childhood. Some of that gap is explained by infant mortality, which was severe, some by disease and famine. Breastfeeding suppresses ovulation, and ancient women who nursed for 2 to 3 years had natural interbirth intervals that reduced lifetime fertility significantly. But researchers who have modeled these populations using known mortality and nursing parameters have consistently found the numbers still do not add up without some intentional fertility reduction. The gap is too large. Something else was reducing births. John Riddle's analysis across his 2 major works on this subject makes the cumulative argument carefully. No single ancient plant method was reliable enough on its own. But a woman who understood the timing argument well enough to avoid the most fertile days, used a barrier preparation with acacia or oil, consumed wild carrot seed preparations post-coitally, and nursed her children for 2 to 3 years, was operating a layered system. Layered systems, even when each component is imperfect, produce cumulative effects. That is what the demographic data appears to reflect. When Dioscorides compiled his pharmacological encyclopedia in the 1st century CE, the work that became the foundational text of European pharmacy for over 1,000 years, he was drawing on exactly this accumulated tradition. What ended up in his pages on contraception was not speculation. It was the distilled clinical observation of generations of practitioners running informal experiments on effectiveness and safety across centuries. The ancient practitioners were not pharmacologists. They did not know about sperm. They did not know about progesterone. What they had was something different: longitudinal observation of outcomes across large numbers of women, passed forward through apprenticeship and text and memory. They were doing something that looked like empirical medicine, without the theoretical framework we use to explain why empirical medicine works. The Acacia cone in the Kahun Papyrus is 3,500 years older than the identification of sperm by Antony van Leeuwenhoek in 1677. The women who wrote and used that prescription did not know what they were preventing the meeting of. They knew only that the preparation, used consistently, seemed to change outcomes. That is a different kind of knowing. It is not inferior knowing. It is knowing built from watching instead of measuring, from experience instead of experiment, from generations of women paying close attention to their own bodies and sharing what they found. That knowledge was fragile in ways that modern pharmacological knowledge is not. It could be lost when the healer died without a successor. It could be suppressed when legal or religious authority decided the women holding it were a problem. The medieval European record shows exactly this: the gradual compression of female reproductive knowledge into narrower channels as institutional authority extended its reach over medicine and over women's bodies. The knowledge survived in fragments, in herbals, in the practices of midwives working below the threshold of official scrutiny. But it was no longer moving freely, which means the woman crouching by the fire in the Nile Delta was not at the beginning of something that progressed steadily forward. She was part of a tradition that accumulated, compressed, survived, was suppressed in places, and re-emerged in others, until the 20th century produced the chemical tools to understand exactly why her acacia paste was doing what she already knew it did. She didn't have the word for lactic acid, she didn't need it. She had the recipe, and the recipe worked, and she passed it to someone who needed it, and that person passed it forward too. The first contraceptive was not invented in a laboratory. It was ground into a cone by a woman who was paying attention, in a world that gave her every reason to. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.